What I admired was his concern for justice and you know, his courage in standing up to governments and even standing up to the board.
He changed just the whole style, shape and substance of the newspaper. He made it a genuinely, in social terms, a genuinely liberal newspaper. It was still very conservative in terms of economic policy and foreign policy, but in terms of social policy, he made it a very liberal newspaper. You know, he backed in the ending of all sorts of censorship. He backed legalisation of what were then illegal gay relationships.
The Age was the first newspaper to support Aboriginal land rights. D.L.N. Raddick and myself had done a lot of work out in the field, which Perkin fully supported. We sat down one lunchtime and said we really thought it was time that we faced the reality of Australia, what had happened to Aborigines, what had happened to our country, and how almost we couldn't be free until we were free. We recognised what had happened. So Graham said, write the leader. So it was a full-length leader, and we said land rights were necessary, but not sufficient for some solution to the problem which rolls on still.
When Bolte was hanging Ronald Ryan, Graham knew, and I remember him saying he had been stopped by the Supreme Court from hanging an earlier murderer, a man called Tate, and he was determined to hang Ronald Ryan, and Graham was absolutely outraged at the vengeful nature of Bolte in this, and I remember him talking about this and sitting down and writing some leaders that just leapt off the page in flames.
The Vietnam War was fresh in everyone's mind. There was a new government fresh in everyone's mind. All these things were, it's like a revolutionary phase in many ways in Australian history, and he was very much at the centre of it. You know, and I mean, there are photographs of him in his office interviewing LBJ. Now those are very kind of, you know, awesome moments too, to all of us.
When I got involved with the anti-war movement, I decided to refuse to register for national service, etc. And I went inside for 10 days, and there was no question of not being paid for that period. It was done. I didn't know how or why. I found out later from Creighton that there'd been a board meeting about it, and Graham had insisted that if I did go in for the full 2 years, I would be paid my salary for that entire period, which I never knew about until after his death.
In 1972, I married Grace Matthews, who was then working for Gough, and then became, at the end of the year, became a Member of Parliament in the Federal Parliament. And I went to Graham and said, you know, do you have a problem with that? And he said, absolutely not. Keep on doing what you're doing, and we have faith in your integrity. And then a few months later, in the following year, Lindsay Thompson, who was the Minister for Education, and Alan Scanlon, who was the Assistant Minister, started using my marriage to attack what I was writing. Perkin published a letter from the head of the Teachers Union saying my reports were completely accurate. And then underneath that, Graham wrote, Mr. Scanlon is a young man in search of a portfolio. His attacks on Iola Matthews are utterly contemptible, and she has our full support.
He recognised the change that was happening in the society, and he reflected it. And as an editor, what was wonderfully exciting about being there was, especially when I became his news editor, was that every day the paper that came out was Graham's vision of the world as he saw it that day.
We'd supported Labor in 1972, and Perkin was excited by this and thought this was, it was his call, in fact, to write that, the leader, its time leader. In 1974, he wanted to do the same thing again, but there were vibes in the air. By this time, the Conservative board in Sydney were in basic control. Perkin flew up, I think, the Wednesday before the election. He'd said to me at the start of the election campaign, "You may write some things that you don't agree with, but stick with me. We'll finish up where we want to be." And what we wanted to do was to support the re-election of the Labor government. He came back and he was very quiet, and on the Friday he said to me, "Chap, Jesus," he said, "I will write this leader myself." And I said, "Are you sure about that?" And I realised something had gone fairly wrong here. I realised also Perkin was going to do it himself. He was going to bite the bullet. So he said to me late on the Friday, he said, "Chap, you've done a good job, why don't you go home, put your feet up?" I said, "No, I'm happy here, I'm happy." And at that stage the leader proofs came up from the composing room and were put on spikes along the sub-editor's desk. And one went onto his spike and one went on the other end. I went and picked it up and I started to read it, and he looked at me, he said, "Are you happy now, you ghoul?" And I realised then the immense pain that he'd felt, because what had happened then was he'd faced the real world of conservative ownership. He'd faced the real world of the limits of power of an editor, even an editor as great as he was.